Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Historiography is a word that, kind of means many things, including how a historic story has been told over time and how that story has changed. Today's program about Dr. James Marion Sims and an enslaved woman named Anarka is an example of just that. For many decades, spanning from the middle of the 1800s and well into the 20th century, Dr. James Marion Sims was celebrated as a pioneering physician and founder of the field of gynecology. But the story began to shift beginning in the 1960s and onwards as more attention was put on the fact that Sims' most celebrated work came from the operations and experiments he conducted on enslaved black women. Many such experiments performed on Anarka herself. The only record of Anarka until recently came just from Sims' own writings, which is strange to think that the evidence of your existence may only come from your tormentor. But my guest today spent several years running down the story of Anarka, and he joins us to talk about it. My guest is J.C. Hullman. J.C. Hullman is the author of the book, Say Anarka, a Young Woman, a Devious Surgeon, and the Harrowing Birth of Modern Women's Health. J.C. Hullman, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Hey, Mitch. Thanks a lot for having me.
Good to have you. Important story. Let's begin with Dr. J. Marion Sims. I was talking about historiography there at the top and how somebody is remembered and how the stories we have of history change through time. Oftentimes that is indicative of how we as a society at any moment changes when we tell these stories. But talk me through a little more about how Dr. Sims has been remembered through time.
Well, the first thing to note about Sims is that he was a very effective self-propagandist and showman. And so he was very cognizant of the fact that he needed to tell his own story. He was operating under the sway of a friendship with P.T. Barnum and went to great lengths to see to it that his story, his narrative was remembered as he wanted it to be remembered. And that led up to his death in 1883. And then subsequently, his story was taken over by most of the male medical establishment at the time, which celebrated him even further, which elevated his profile even further. And that version of the history held sway really until the middle of the 20th century when the reevaluation began. So Sims' history and the way that he controlled not only his own story, but the way he controlled the story of Anarka and Lucy and Betsy and the approximately 7 others who made up his initial group of experimental subjects. And those experiments are the creation story of modern women's health. Sims controlled their story too, in very much the same way that he had once controlled their bodies. And so it wasn't until really the 1960s that, as you said, that a reevaluation of that history began. But for the most part, it was Sims himself and then a kind of mob or core of hagiographers who just worked really hard to erect a kind of rhetorical facade to Sims that matched the literal monuments that were erected to Sims, first in New York and then in Alabama and South Carolina.
The monument in New York has recently come down. People probably heard once again of Dr. Sims because of that monument, that statue coming down. And before it came down, there was this sort of iconic photo of activists, black women activists, wearing medical gowns with blood on them in front of this statue.
Yeah, I mean, there had been a long-standing effort to call attention to that. That effort was inspired by Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, and then it got a big boost from Deirdre Cooper Owen's book, Medical Bondage, about 10 years later. But in the middle there were a series of activist groups, women's groups, African-American groups in East Harlem that had been trying to raise attention, trying to raise awareness and consciousness about Sims and the legacy and the statue that many of them walk past every day. And that took a long time. I wound up writing an article about that monument myself for Harper's Magazine back in 2017. It was part of the earliest work that I did on the story. But that stood and it stands as a kind of evidence that you can fight City Hall. That there was so much 10 years of resistance on the part of departments and organizations in New York City, pushing back against the idea that one of their monuments would be removed because of concerns over its contents. It had never happened in 250 years. And those groups, persisted for a decade. I did my little backup work to try to help that, and that statue was removed in 2018. So that story, that part of the Sims story, stands as evidence today that fighting back can achieve results.
How does James Marion Sims, and he's also referred to as J. Marion Sims, but my notes I keep saying James because that's what I have in front of me.
That's his name.
But a lot of times it's just the J period.
Right.
So not to confuse folks, how does he get this moniker of the founder of Gynecology?
Well, so there was no gynecology when he started working, and so the experiments that he claimed to perform on Anarka, Lucy, and Betsy, and specifically the cure that he claimed to have achieved on Anarka in 1849 after 30 experiments were performed, all without anesthesia. That, in retrospect, was identified as a kind of watershed moment in what was emerging as a distinct field of medicine. It's all part of a larger story about the male medical establishment taking away from women what had been a traditionally female facet of the medical world. But nevertheless, that the emergence of gynecology as a distinct field of medicine was thought to have more or less begun with that cure. And I'm kind of putting scare quotes around it because one of the things that my work discovered was that, in fact, Anarka was never cured. The so-called cure of the father of gynecology was never actually cured. So the story is a lot more complicated than Sims' version of his own history would have led us to believe, and did lead us to believe, because that version of the story more or less held sway for almost 2 centuries.
You piqued my interest there when you said with Dr. J. Marion Sims, and in that moment, men sort of wrestle away the field of health for women. What was going on before that? What happened before then?
Well, the practice of midwifery, that would have been largely how conditions peculiar to women were treated and handled and diagnosed and understood, particularly, obviously, birthing practices. So there was this kind of period of a takeover, and it's sort of analogous to a period when women's bodies were practically like a frontier, and men were exploring it as though it was this terra incognita, and naming parts of women's bodies for themselves. So the pouch of Douglas, for example, or the fallopian tubes, for that matter, are named for men who claimed to have discovered them. And of course, it's as dubious as saying that Columbus discovered America, right? But it's all part of that same trajectory where a white male perspective is determining everything and snatching away what had been a female precinct of medicine for themselves, and then building their careers around it.
Did Dr. Sims discover anything, create any cures from these experiments that he conducted on these enslaved women?
So when Sims died, there were a whole list of things that he was said to have achieved or done. That he thought that his work on infant lockjaw was going to be as important as anything else that he claimed to have done. And of course, infant lockjaw turns out to be tetanus, and he'd been performing surgery on enslaved babies to try to cure what was a bacterial infection, and he didn't know that even when he died. There was a whole bunch of things, and this is a really difficult history because it's the false claims were so deeply embedded in the extant sources that you don't have to look far to find a very highly respected source that is repeating something that a deeper forensic accounting of Sims' career reveals to be false or untrue. And so what I'd noticed when I started on Sims was that most of the accounts of him had tended to focus on the 4 years of these experimental surgeries in Montgomery, Alabama. And the remaining decades of his career, he kept practicing medicine for another 30, 40 years after that, tended to get short shrifted. And so some of the claims that he made in those years tended to get overlooked. And so you would find sometimes even in the works that were antagonistic to him, sometimes they would say, well, okay, he did X or Y. And what I found when I really went into a deep dive on Sims was that virtually everything, meaning I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but that virtually everything that was attributed to him was eventually either debunked or shown to be dangerous, or was actually the work of someone else that he had as one of his colleagues put it, as he had adroitly purloined, he'd stolen from other doctors. So the short answer to the question is no. When we look at what's happening clinically today, there really isn't anything that traces back to Sims. And I know there's going to be people out there listening who are going to say, well, the Sims speculum or the Sims position, the truth is that even those, the Sims speculum, which does get used today and which still has that name, was in use. This is a kind of lever speculum. It's not the invention of the speculum, but it is a kind of lever speculum. And and again,
what is the speculum?
A speculum is a device that's used for vaginal examination with a variety of different kinds of mechanical contrivances. It can work in a number of different ways. It can be anything from a hollow tube to something that works with sort of like opposing teeth that open up but this was specifically a lever speculum, and so but even that, Sims' assistant from Alabama pointed out that particular kind of speculum had been in use in Europe long before Sims ever conceived of it or claimed to have conceived of it.
One last question about J. Marion Sims' legacy, how he was remembered, before we get into the real meat of the story that you tell here. In the middle of the 20th century, his autobiography is published or maybe republished. You'll clarify that for me. And it's called Woman's Surgeon.
Right. Yeah. So Sims' autobiography is called The Story of My Life, and it was published posthumously. He was dictating it in the last couple of years of his life. It was never finished, and it appeared in 1885. Initially, it was selling really well, but one of the mysteries that I never really did figure out is that his family had it pulled from circulation, and I'm not really sure why or how that came about. I was telling a very different story, so that wasn't like the main thing I was trying to research. And then in 1950. About 75 years later, his only full-length biography is published, and that's called Woman's Surgeon. That's by a guy named Dr. Seal Harris.
A biography, forgive me.
Yeah. And so that book, is Seal Harris. I mentioned that mob of hagiographers, before, and Seal Harris is by far the largest and loudest voice in that crowd. He'd been a Sims champion for many years, and he was 80 years old when his book was published in 1950. So he had been tooting the Sims horn for a long time.
It's turned into a radio program, a radio drama that you have a YouTube page where you have 20 or more 5-minute or so videos telling this story as well, along with your book, say Anarka. And they're really well produced videos. And on that YouTube page, you actually provide the radio drama.
Yeah, I mean, and it's amazingly ridiculous, right? If you listen to it, you almost have to start chuckling as soon as you hear it. But it's called the episode. This is from a radio show called Cavalcade of America, and it's focusing on Sim's time in New York City. And at that point, the hagiographical accounts of Sims have it's like the pinnacle of that. And so this episode is called Sir Galahad in Manhattan. and it's
Sir Galahad.
Sir Galahad in Manhattan. Yeah. And it's amazing because it's like when we listen to it now, it's just like peering back through time to see that patriarchal white supremacist mindset and how that was just determining how everything was seen, and the process of turning Sims into this godly hero was right at that moment, probably at its pinnacle. It's the apotheosis of J. Marion Sims, maybe. But I have to say that was happening long before as well. Like I said, immediately after he died, those efforts to erect that rhetorical facade to him began.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with J.C. Hallman. He is the author of the book, Say Anarka, A Young Woman, a Devious Surgeon, and the Harrowing Birth of Modern Women's Health. Let's talk about the women who were experimented on. Again, there's around 10 women altogether. 3 of them, we have their names. Again, of course, Anarka, but you've also mentioned Lucy and Betsy.
Yeah, so the initial group of experimental subjects were comprised of, the sources disagree. Sims did not tell the story consistently, from source to source. So, in one source he says 6 to 7 others in addition to Anarka, Lucy, and Betsy, and in another source he says 7 to 8 others. And so 3 plus 6 to 8, it gets you to approximately 10. So yeah, from 1846 to 1849, the initial group of experiments, there's approximately 10 women. Of those, 3 names are known: Anarka, Lucy, and Betsy. In addition to that, there are other women's names who are known to have been experimented on at that same location, in this infirmary in downtown Montgomery. And so there's approximately 20 others whose stories and whose names are known. And I've been working with the now owner of that property, who's going to be turning it into a clinic in its own right, to make sure that those women's names are known and that those stories are told as well.
Well, these women that he experiments on they're enslaved. Who are the slave masters? Where do they come from? They're not under the auspices, I guess, in this way, or maybe they are, of Dr. Sims.
No, so these were plantations in and around Montgomery, Alabama, and they were they varied. I mean, they were cotton plantations, and it's important to note that their motives in wanting to have their enslaved women cured would have been suspect, because particularly at this point in the history of slavery in America, breeding programs were very, very common on plantations. This is the late 1830s, early 1840s. Cotton came in and was booming, and cotton was king, as they say. But then there'd been a big crisis in 1837. Cotton was being overplanted, and so plantations were struggling, and would be augmenting the money they could make by breeding additional enslaved people, and you sometimes selling them, or sometimes taking out slave mortgages, and so these were plantation owners in and around Montgomery, but they were plantation owners who were likely struggling. The numbers from the plantation where Anarka came from are really striking. So one of the things I did, when I first started researching the story, was ask, well, could anything of any of these women be found? And Anarka was the most consequential of the experimental subjects, and she was one who had a pretty distinctive name. So
not her real name, correct, or not her actual name.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out that there are alternate spellings, but even the alternate spellings, it's not like she went from an ordinary name like Amy or something to Anarka, and so, but the distinctiveness of the name made me think, well, maybe something could be found. And I could see, even though there had been this ongoing 50, 60-year reevaluation of Sims' legacy, there hadn't been a concerted effort to really find any of these women. And so, when I went to Alabama, what Sims' autobiography had said was that she'd come from the Westcott plantation. So I went looking for Westcott plantation materials, and I found a variety of estate inventories. And in terms of who these plantation owners were and what their motives were, it was really telling, because when I first found Anarka's name, it was from an 1828 document. And at that point, she was Anaka, Anaka.
Hmm.
And that was 1828. And at that point on that plantation, there were 29 enslaved persons on that plantation. And then the next instance of her name was from 13 years later, 1841. And now she's Anarchy. And it's the same person, as the ages correspond and everything. And now there are 80 enslaved people on this plantation. And of those 80, 13 years later, of those 80, 30 of them are younger than 13 years old of age. So it's clear, you really can't come to any other conclusion than that this plantation was breeding enslaved people, and that Anarka's subsequent pregnancy, which results in the condition that Sims is going to set out to try to cure, would have been, she would have gotten pregnant as a part of that breeding program. It's sort of an unavoidable conclusion.
And that's why Dr. Sims is brought in.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the amazing things is that Sims' legacy for so long, he was heralded as this altruistic person who was trying to cure suffering womanhood, and this, even the story of the experiments, that was always told as though all the struggles and the investment he had to make, it all just sort of demonstrated his temerity and his persistence, and there was little discussion of the experience of the enslaved women who were enduring these surgeries without anesthesia. And but it's wrong. It's wrong. Sims was, I mean, deeper digging reveals that Sims was desperately searching for the kind of innovative surgery that would make his name, that would give him wealth, that would allow him to leave Alabama, which he promptly did. And on top of that, it's the goals of the plantation owners, and what they did is they more or less lent these enslaved women to Sims for the duration of the experiments. That their motive would have been, to either return these women to the plantations, either to breed additional enslaved people, or to perform backbreaking labor, or to become the sexual objects of overseers and the masters themselves, which was also very common. So the idea that Sims was somehow acting out of altruistic motive is really laughable when you look more deeply at the sources, and you realize, well, no, he was catering to the plantation mindset and the plantation's economic desire to try to get out of their investment in these enslaved women what they could.
Anarka was more than just Sims, than somebody that Sims experimented on. Didn't she also serve as a nurse, assisted him, and even before the experiments began, cared for him when he was dealing with a serious illness. She herself was a healer.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the sort of deeper dive into her part of the story. So the book's really a dual biography. Half of it's Sim's story from his point of view, trying to give him, enough rope that he can really, hang himself in the telling of his story. But then half of it is an excavation of Anarka's story, to the extent that that's possible, by finding primary sources, and then by using other sources, the voices from the WPA Slave Narrative Project to complete her story. But what the primary sources suggest, or just simply state unequivocally, is that Anarka was working as a nurse both before, during, and after the Alabama fistula experiments. And that comes from a variety of sources, and sometimes it's just a direct source. Sometimes you're making an inference because of something that you don't see in a source, for example. But what it all adds up to is that she would have been trained very early on by a woman who was known as Dr. Woman on the Westcott plantation. That for a time she was leased to another plantation where she first met Sims and cared for him when he had malaria. And then during the period of the official experiments, she was leased out to a hotel as a nurse in town called Montgomery Hall. And then later in life, there's evidence that she was working as a midwife.
In this book, say Anarka, you write it as though it was a novel. And you mentioned that you used the slave narratives that were captured during the New Deal, part of the New Deal program, WPA, slave narratives. You use, and my understanding is you read all of the slave narratives, and then you use this to help fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to recognize is that you could do a traditional biography of Sims because there was his sources, his letters, his correspondence, his papers, all the papers of his friends, and conducting a pretty traditional deep dive biography. You could do that with him, but you couldn't really do that with Anarka. I mean, I did find a lot of primary sources. What I'm saying about Anarka is built out of primary sources of her life that are not relied on in any other account of his life or her life. For decades, the only thing anybody's known about Anarka was what came from him. So,
which is weird. I said that in my introduction, just sort of weird to think your tormentor is your only evidence of existing.
Right. And so, I had this, I knew her whole life trajectory up to finding her gravesite in a remote forest in Virginia. And so I knew all that, but it was like a scaffold of facts. And what this story needed for a lot of reasons, sometimes just the complexity of the issues that are raised by it, is that it needed to be felt as much as it needed to be thought about. And so in telling the story, I wanted to present milieus and atmospheres and scenes and characters, and to make it a read that immersed you in the presence of these people to the extent that was possible. And as I said, with Sims, you could do that in a kind of traditional way, but with Anarka, you needed something different. I had that scaffold of facts. How was I going to augment that? Well, I decided to augment it not by just imagining things, but by calling on another set of facts. And that was the Slave Narrative Project from the Federal Writers Project that was part of the Works Progress Administration efforts in the late 1930s. And there were hundreds of interviewers that spread out across the country to interview thousands of formerly enslaved people. It made about 55 books worth of material total, and I read them all. And that took a year, and it was one of the most profound reading experiences of my life, and I was stunned because there was so much in it that I wasn't familiar with. That I mean, I think today we watch television or film depictions of slavery, and we think we got a handle on it, but the truth is there was so much more, and so I was able to use those materials to call on the narratives of those enslaved people to give a sense of life and breath to Anarka's story.
In these narratives, did you find other examples of medical experiments?
Yeah, I mean there were definitely references to that, but it was more people's firsthand accounts. So it was more women who worked as midwives were telling stories about their own medical practices or the medicines that enslaved peoples had used. There was a tendency, I think in general, I would say that these were formerly enslaved people who were looking back half a century on their experience, but it was still very present for them. And what I often came across is they would talk about how horrible it was, and sometimes they would detail that, but sometimes it was left a little bit vague. And what was more important for them was the more quotidian aspects of their lives. What they dressed, how they dressed, what they ate, and I, and that reading all of them together like that, it just brought the world alive, for me in a way that I then tried to invest into Anarka's story.
You mentioned finding her grave. Did you find it on your own? Was this a grave that was, I imagine, was lost, considering that the only thing we knew of Anarka before was through Sim's writings?
Yeah, no, I didn't do anything on my own in this book. There were many people. There were the scholars and historians who had written about this before me, who helped set me on the right path. There were librarians and archivists who helped at various junctures. It helped me make out some of the ancient handwriting. That's you have to like learn. You have to go to take a class and learn how to read that stuff, and not literally. I'm not saying literally, but it was hard. Yeah. So I kind of knew what had happened to in at the end of Anarka's life, but I knew that she'd been leased to a man named Charles Mason in Virginia, and I was in Virginia. I was doing a lot of on the ground searching. That's what this kind of work required. You couldn't do it by just sort of sifting around on Ancestry.com, right? I mean, that was a great starting place, but it was like Wikipedia. You start there and then you go out and you find stuff. And so eventually it was going to a probate office in King George, Virginia, and finding this Charles Mason, who was Anarka's final enslaver, and then being told that a woman named Elizabeth Lee, who was the local historian for that county in Virginia, that she would know, and it turned out that she did, and with her help, and then with the help of a hunter who had stumbled across this gravestone in the forest decades before, I managed actually to get escorted out there and found the gravesite. And of course, they had no idea that there was someone important who had been interred there. And there's an effort now, to sort of protect that site, to make sure that site is accessible to. That is protected, that it's not going to get accidentally desecrated, and that it is accessible to descendants. And we've working with another researcher, we've found descendants of Anarka's family, specifically Anarka's husband.
Oh, I'm going to follow up on that in a moment, but I want to stay on the gravesite. Was there a tombstone that had her name?
Yeah. I mean, the stone is actually a bit of a mystery still. There in Alabama, I found the stone of an enslaved man who appeared on a list with Anarka from that 1828 estate inventory I said. But that stone's like it's about this high. It's really
so it's just maybe a foot or two.
Yeah,
for the radio listeners.
Yeah, it's yeah. Sorry, I'm using my hand. It's about 12 inches high, and it's quite small. But the stone in Virginia is large. It's maybe 3 feet high, and it looks newer. So Anarka, she dies in approximately 1870. Her husband, his name is Lorenzo. He dies about 15 years later. The stone looks younger than that. It almost looks sort of early 20th century. And I haven't yet figured that out. I mean, I think it's, the last part of Anarka's life connects with the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. And it turns out the wife of this Charles Mason was a great granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, and that becomes part of the story. I did a month of research at the International Center for Jefferson Studies just to research this part of Anarka's story. So that might explain it, but the stone itself is an ongoing mystery. How did it get there? I mean, this is a really rugged piece of land, and the stone must weigh 300 pounds, and it's hard to get there. It is hard to get there just when all you're carrying is your iPhone so you can take a picture, and how you would get this stone out there. It's not quite as baffling a mystery as building the pyramids, but it's sort of the same kind of thing.
Does that put into question? I mean, if it was put there later after she would have died, and again, it's both her name and her husband's name, so I mean, it's very clear. Does that put in adult? I mean, does that? Obviously, that raises questions, but does that put into doubt as to whether it was their grave? And does that put into question? I guess this is a second completely different question, so forgive me. I'll give you as much time as you'd like to take these on. Does that suggest that someone previously had a sense of her importance?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that the family, talked about, that there was a sense that that something of importance had happened there. But it wasn't there wasn't a lot of clarity about that, and I'm being a little vague in talking about the descendants because it's not clear that they want to be identified. And but it is something that appears to have been there. There were hints of it in the family lore, I think is safe to say,
Hmm.
and it wasn't something that they understood. And when I eventually took a one of the descendants out to the gravesite, he hadn't known about it before, but he hadn't known that it was there. He knew that his family was from this part of Virginia, but he didn't know about the grave. So the memory of it had faded. And but like I said, what we're doing now is we're making sure that grave is protected, and we're making sure that the descendants are going to have access to it, when they want, so that they can go and pay respects to their ancestors.
I could only imagine what it must have been like to be researching for this person, Anarka, going through all the records and trying to figure out who this person is, and then suddenly coming upon her grave, a tombstone with her name.
Yeah, it was sort of two memories. It was two feelings at once, because on the one hand, it was great to see a grave with the name on it that was clearly seemed clearly to be a reference, but I needed to do a lot more work to really verify that. And the YouTube channel that you mentioned, which is called Anarka Archive, that is an attempt to sort of walk viewers through all of the evidence, telling Anarka's full life story leading up to that gravesite. So you can go see the grave on the YouTube channel. And but yeah, I mean, at that moment, standing at the gravesite, it was, because from the beginning of the project, it was a fight, to stop Sims from going on controlling this woman's story. That he had essentially turned her into a footnote of his own story, and just taken her away entirely. And so standing at the gravesite was a reminder that if you work hard enough and you look everywhere and you get a little lucky in the end, that the truth can be found. The truth is still out there. These fraudulent histories, and this isn't the only one, right? In American history in particular, but these fraudulent histories can be corrected. The evidence is still there.
J.C. Hullman is our guest. He joins us for a conversation about his book called Say Anarka, A Young Woman, a Devious Surgeon, and the Harrowing Birth of Modern Women's Health. Again, it was really striking to me when you were talking about the name Anarka, because of its uniqueness, made it actually possible to find her. Whereas as the couple of other women's names that we have, Betsy and Lucy, I suspect would be much harder because you're not sure if it's the right Betsy or Lucy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think that eventually I did find a document that seems to have all three names on it. Sort of, which is pretty remarkable, because one of the mysteries was that after 1849, all of these women, all 10 of the women, just sort of seemed to disappear. Sims had taken an assistant in Alabama who came along right at the moment when Anarka was supposed to have been cured. This guy went on to be Sims' greatest critic. One of the weird parts of this history is that that in reevaluating this past, those of us who are on the antagonistic side to Sims' narrative get accused of sort of bringing a woke sensibility to bear, or otherwise projecting modern values into the past, and that's just not true. There were many doctors. I was coming down pretty hard on the male medical establishment earlier, and that's certainly true, but it's also true that there were many doctors, even presidents of the AMA, that were sending up the warning flags about Sims and his methods in his lifetime. And what was remarkable about Nathan Bozeman, when he came along and joined Sims, and worked alongside him for a few years before becoming his greatest critic, is that Bozeman never saw Anarka. Bozeman never saw Lucy. He never saw Betsy, never saw any of the initial experimental subjects. So when he later wrote about them, he just had to write and say, well, I never saw them, but this is what their cases were likely like. And so figuring out just what happened after 1849 is remarkable. And it reveals that even at that point, even in 1849, Sims seems to have been going to lengths to make sure that he controlled the narrative. And so then eventually, I did find documents that had Anarka's name and Lucy Ann and Betsy, and it's the only time I found all three names on the same piece of paper or in the same list of enslaved persons. And and that was kind of the beginning of building Anarka's trajectory, finding out just what happened after 1849, because for all intents and purposes, that was where the mystery really began.
Were these experiments and operations he performed on these women, would you consider it torture? And how do you deal with the idea of whether or not there was consent?
Well, consent is impossible. An enslaved person can't provide consent, period. Right. But I would also point out that Sims was performing experiments on enslaved men for a jaw cancer of the jaw just a few weeks before the fistula experiments began. And he invented a board so he could strap this enslaved man down. And when he wrote about it, he bragged about how what he had shown was that you could perform capital or major surgery without consent, his words, right? Without a willing patient. So he didn't care. Right, but consent is just it's impossible for an enslaved person. What was the first part of the question?
Well, the first part of the question is, would you characterize these procedures as torture? Which, from what you just said, sounds like yes.
Well, certainly torturous. I think that if the literal definition of torture is that somebody knows something and you inflict pain on them until they tell you, then no, it's not torture. But I think that we have come to commonly use torture in a more figurative sense, and certainly any kind of surgery or experimental surgery, vaginal surgery, that is without anesthesia is going to be incredibly painful and is going to feel torturous. But I think as well, when Sims first performed an experiment, or all of these experiments, it wasn't just him in the room. There would be another dozen people. And the position that Sims had these women in, what's known as a knee-chest position, is incredibly awkward. And so I would say, even without the question of the actual surgery being performed, or the actual experiment being performed, the situation itself is a violation. The situation itself is a form of psychological torture. And I think that there would have been a lot of coercion that was happening at the same time. And in the same way, in criminal context, when we talk about coerced confessions, that's a form of torture too. And so my answer to you is both no in a literal sense, but an unqualified yes in every other sense as the word.
Were painkillers used?
Painkillers were being used at the time. I mean, this is another big question, because chloroform and ether were just coming into use at this time. But Sims was using morphine for other enslaved people as a painkiller. There was nitrous oxide had been in use for decades, and Sims would have been aware of that. And so and simply alcohol as well. I mean, even the case that I mentioned with the experiment on the enslaved man, who was strapped to a board. Sims gave that guy 60 drops of morphine before he began the procedure, but it turned out that it didn't take effect until he was done. And so it didn't. I mean, Sims just didn't care. He knew that these women were feeling pain, and he was just indifferent to it. Is just the sad reality.
He didn't use the painkillers with the women?
No, he didn't. I mean, there were, later in life, Sims would say um, that the only time you needed anesthesia with fistula cases, this is the condition he was attempting to cure, was when the fistula involved the cervix or the urethra. But it had to do with the position that these women were in, this knee chest position, because if you were unconscious, you wouldn't be able to hold that position. And he believed that that position was necessary to what he wanted to do. When he went to New York and he started experimenting on white women, he discovered that no, you could use a different position. It's known as a left lateral position, and that worked just as well. And then that would have enabled the use of anesthesia.
So he experimented on white women too.
Later, yeah, I mean, in New York, and particularly on Irish immigrants. So when Sims left Alabama for New York, he traded one vulnerable population for another. It wasn't, I mean, obviously, Irish immigrants are not enslaved. They're not enslaved people. But you're talking about women who were escaping the potato famine on board coffin ships, and they show up in New York, and they're poor, and they were judged to be of the proper lower class for surgical experimentation, as Sims described openly many times over.
Anarka died in 1870, so she lived through the Civil War, through emancipation. What were you able to find about her life post this period of time that she spent with Sims?
Well, in terms of the raw facts, it was fairly scant. There were Freedmen's Bureau records about the property where they lived. That her husband Lorenzo, was engaged to work his former enslavers' land after emancipation. They stayed where they were enslaved. And that was very likely a function of the fact that Anarka was never cured. The documents that we have show that she was sickly, that she had a number of children living with her. We do know that the documents show that Anarka had at least 10 pregnancies that came to term, and that she had a number of children living with her when she died. But she was also very sickly and likely had a cough that was a result of the application of chloroform in further experiments that she endured in Richmond, Virginia, at a later time. So you can piece together bits of what her life must have been like. But it's like I said, it's that scaffold of facts.
Yeah. How old was she when she died?
Well, we don't know how old she was, period. I think that her date of birth was probably around 1826, 1827. And her death record lists her at 45 as at her death.
You do run the website anarchaarchive.com. What's the purpose of the website?
So, the book is based on, it's heavily researched, but it reads like a novel, as we say, but it's not really, it's not a work of the imagination in the same way that you would normally think of that. It's not historical fiction. And so there is no wanton invention that's happening in this story. And so in telling the story, I mean, there were about 5,000 citations total. And that's a lot, and so when we were talking about what to include in the book, or whether we should include sources in the book, we pulled out a selection of the sources, 7%, and that added up to 85 additional pages, for the book. It would have been a lot. And that would have only been a tiny selection. So when I decided to create the anarchaarchive.com, it was really to try to be true to all of the sources that I called on to, because I could include them all. Space wouldn't be a question online. And what I wanted to create was not only a biography, effectively, but what I wound up calling an illustrated biography, that every time I'm calling on a source, I can just show it to you. So if I make a claim and it's based on this source, you can go and you can find the traditional citation, but you can also see the source itself. And I think that that's particularly important when you're telling a history that in so many ways is overturning that fraudulent but previously accepted history, that you have to make sure that scholars and interested parties have that ability to scrutinize the sources you relied on and to scrutinize the narrative choices as well when you're relying on inference or speculation. I was trying to really reinvent what a bibliography can be, and then to present it in a way that was comprehensive, and then as well offered interested people a chance to feel some of the excitement that I felt as I was sort of conducting all of this research and finding those needles and haystacks all over the place. So that was the goal of the archive.
Again, the website is anarkaarchive.com. J.C. Hallman has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about his book, Say, Anarka, a young woman, a devious surgeon, and the harrowing birth of modern women's health. J.C. Hallman, that was very informative, and I thank you for taking the time to join us to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.